The moment Celine stepped into the great hall, the bond hit her like a wave slamming against stone. It was not gentle, and it was not warm. It was a violent, breathless collision that stole the air from her lungs and stopped her feet mid-step on the cold marble floor. Her hand flew to her chest. Her heart was beating so hard, she was certain the wolves nearest to her could hear it. Every nerve in her body turned toward the throne at the far end of the hall, where Alpha King Cale Ravencrest stood watching the blood moon ceremony with cold, unreadable eyes. He felt it too. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his gaze swept the crowd slowly, and then stopped completely, when it landed on her. For 1/2 second, something raw and undone moved behind those silver eyes. Something cracked open, briefly, like light coming through a wall. Then it was gone, buried under stone. Celine Vale had not come to the blood moon ceremony to find a mate. She had come because her mother, the palace's head healer, had fallen gravely ill 3 days ago, and someone had to carry the trays of ceremonial herbs to the altar table. That someone had been Celine, with her worn leather boots and her plain gray dress, standing among lords and ladies draped in silk and wolf fur, with silver threads and jewels at their throats. She was 19 years old. She had calluses on her palms from grinding medicine. She smelled of lavender root and old books, and the clean particular soap her mother had made every winter since before Celine could remember. She was the last person anyone in that hall would have expected the king to be bound to. The ceremony continued around her. Deep drums beat a slow rhythm she could feel in her teeth and behind her eyes. The court moved through its sacred motions with practiced precision, the high shaman speaking the old words, the fire in the altar bowl burning first gold and then silver with the herbs she had carried. Celine stood at the edge of the crowd near the altar, clutching the now empty herb tray against her chest like a shield, watching the king from beneath her lashes and telling herself she was imagining it, telling herself the bond sense was a confusion, a trick of the blood moon's particular light streaming through the high windows. She had heard that sometimes the moon played tricks on young wolves who were nervous. She was young. She was nervous. She was standing in a room full of the most powerful beings in the kingdom, and her boots had a hole in the left sole that she had been meaning to patch for 2 weeks. She was still repeating these reassurances inside her head when the ceremony ended and the king descended from the dais. He walked straight toward her. The crowd parted for him, the way water parts for a stone dropped into its center. Instantly, completely, without question. Lords and ladies stepped aside with lowered heads. His advisors moved behind him in a tight, careful cluster, including the woman Celine recognized as Lady Scarlet Duskbane, whose expression shifted into something sharp and watchful, and very controlled, the moment the king began to move toward the altar's edge. Scarlet's eyes moved to Celine and stayed there, bright and calculating, while her face held a perfect social smile. Cale Ravencrest stopped 2 feet in front of Celine. He was taller than she had understood from the distance of the dais, and broader in the shoulders, and his presence had a weight to it that pressed on the air around him. His eyes, up close, were the color of winter sky just before a storm, gray edged with silver, sharp and unusually clear. He smelled of cedar and iron, and something wild underneath, something that the bond inside her chest reached toward with aching, helpless recognition. He looked at her for a long moment, just looked, as though she were a problem he was solving. Celine, to her own deep embarrassment, could not make herself look away. Then he spoke, and every word was a door being shut. "I know what you felt," he said. His voice was low and controlled, carrying clearly enough for the ring of nearest courtiers to hear every syllable. "I felt it too. I want you to know that I do not deny the bond exists." He paused. The drums had stopped. The hall was very quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when many people stop breathing at the same time. But an alpha king does not bind himself to a servant's daughter. The throne requires a match worthy of this kingdom. I reject this bond, formally. And finally, the silence that followed was the loudest thing Celine had ever experienced. She felt the rejection move through her like a blade. Not a clean cut, but something that tore slowly, pulling apart a connection she had not known was already being woven. Her wolf let out a sound inside her that had no human word for it. A sound at the bottom of her chest that was not grief exactly, but contained grief inside it, the way a river contains the rain that made it. Her eyes burned. Her knees wanted to fold. She did not let them, She thought of her mother, who had raised her alone and had never once folded in front of anyone who was watching. She thought of every morning she had stood at the grinding stone while it was still dark, making the medicines that kept this palace running, that kept its wolves healthy, that no one thanked anyone for, because it was simply done. She thought of the hole in her left boot. Celine Vale set the herb tray down on the altar behind her, with a quiet, deliberate sound. She straightened her spine. She looked directly at the Alpha King, at those winter-gray eyes that were watching her with something that was not quite as cold as he wanted it to be. And she spoke the old formal words of bond acceptance that every wolf child was taught in case they were ever needed. "I hear you," she said. Her voice did not shake. "I release you. I accept." 3 sentences, 6 words, the most painful thing she had ever said, and she said them cleanly, without stumbling, the way she performed every difficult task, with full attention and complete hands. Then she bowed, not the bow of a servant, but the bow of someone whose dignity had not been touched, turned, and walked out of the great hall at a pace that did not hurry and did not drag. She heard the sound of the crowd shifting behind her, heard the particular murmur that large groups make when something unexpected has happened and they are deciding what to make of it. She heard Lady Scarlet say something in a light, carrying voice that drew a ripple of polite laughter from the nearest cluster of nobles. Celine did not stop. She did not look back. She went through the side corridor, through the servants' passage, down the stairs, to the lower healing wing, where her mother's room was, and she sat on the cold stone floor, outside her mother's door, with her back against the wall, and her knees drawn to her chest. Through the door she could hear her mother's slow, even breathing, the deep breath of someone lost in fever sleep. She listened to it and let herself be still. She did not cry, not because crying was wrong, but because the emotion was too large and too precise for tears, which were a kind of overflow, and she was not overflowing. She was thinking. She had always been better at thinking than overflowing. She sat on that floor for a long time. The stone was cold through her dress. The palace quieted around her as the ceremony's guests moved toward the banquet rooms and the night settled in. She listened to her mother breathe, and she turned the situation over in her mind the way she turned a problem in her hands, examining every angle, looking for what was real underneath what was felt. What was real? The king had rejected her, formally, in front of his court, with words that could not be taken back. What was also real? She could not stay here, not as a servant who was also a rejected mate, not under the eyes of a court that had watched her walk out, not in a palace where the air itself would remind her every day of what the bond had felt like in the 1 second before it was refused. She knew wolf packs. She knew what happened to rejected mates who stayed near the one who had turned them away. The bond did not stop just because one party had said the words. It ached. It pulled. It made people foolish over time. She was not going to be foolish. She was going to leave. But if she left with her scent still intact, his trackers could find her within days. She was not naive about this. She was a low-born healer's daughter who knew things about powerful people that they would rather she did not know, simply because she had spent her life moving quietly through rooms where decisions were made. A loose end, like Celine, would be found and brought back, and made to sign documents, and be quiet somewhere convenient. She was not going to be quiet and convenient. She was going to be gone. By the time the palace bells rang midnight, she had made her decision. She went to find the moonless witch. Not many people in the kingdom knew that the old woman lived in the lower city, in a building that looked from the outside like a root cellar with a bakery attached. Celine knew because her mother had sent her there twice in the past 3 years for medicinal compounds that the palace stores did not carry, specific preparations that required knowledge the palace physicians either did not have or did not want to be associated with. The witch's name was Edna. She was perhaps 60 years old and perhaps 90, and she had the eyes of someone who had seen everything and found most of it deeply unsurprising. The streets of the lower city were quiet at this hour, lit by oil lamps set in iron brackets at the corners. Celine moved quickly, her empty herb tray left behind, her one bag already packed. She had packed it before the ceremony, which she would later understand had been her instincts working faster than her conscious mind. When she reached the building, she raised her hand to knock, and the door opened before her knuckles touched wood. Edna stood in the warm, herb-thick air of her doorway and looked at Celine with the expression of someone who had been expecting exactly this visitor. "Blood moon night," the old woman said. "Rejected bond. Come in." The inside of the building was warm. Things hung from the ceiling that Celine could not name. She sat across a narrow table from Edna, and a candle burned between them, and she explained what she wanted. She was very clear about it. Not revenge. Not a way to make him suffer for what he had done. Not a love working of any kind. She wanted the right of Ash. Edna looked at her for a long time after she said it. Long enough that Celine had to resist the urge to fill the silence. That right removes your scent from the world, the old woman said finally. Every wolf, including yourself, will lose the ability to track you by scent. You will be invisible to the bond sense. You will not smell like a wolf at all, to wolf noses. You understand the cost is not a small one. She folded her hands on the table. Your wolf goes quiet, not dead, quiet. Like a voice on the other side of a closed door. You will hear her if you are very still and you try. But the full voice, the open channel between you and her, that closes, and it cannot be undone except by your own choice and your own considerable pain. I understand, Celine said. You are very young to make this choice, the old woman said. She was not unkind about it, merely factual. I am old enough to know that I cannot stay in this city, Celine said, and she meant it in every direction the words could go. And if I leave with my scent, his trackers will find me within the week. I will spend the rest of my life being brought back, being managed, being a problem that someone more powerful than me keeps deciding to solve for their own convenience. She folded her hands on the table, a gesture she had not planned, but that mirrored the witch's own. I would rather be invisible. Edna studied her for another long moment. Then she nodded once and named her price. It was not money. Edna had more money than she needed. She named the silver pendant at Celine's throat. Her grandmother's, then her mother's, passed down through the women of her line with the careful deliberateness of people who did not have many things worth passing down. Celine's hand went to it without thinking. She held it for one breath. Then she unclasped it and set it on the table between them. Her hand shook slightly as she let it go. She did not reach back for it. The rite took until nearly sunrise. Edna worked with a concentration that was absolute, and a silence that was not uncomfortable. Celine sat and breathed, and felt things change inside her, the way the color of the sky changes at dawn. Gradually, then all at once. When it was done, she sat for a moment in the changed air of herself, and took stock. She could still smell the beeswax of the candle, still smell the herbs and the bread from next door, still smell the night air through the small window above the table. But the deep wolf language of scent, the layered, living thread of pack and bond and mine and known, that was muted, as if someone had placed thick cloth between her and a sound she had been hearing her whole life. She could sense the shape of it, but not the detail. She thanked Edna. Edna poured her a cup of something hot and watched her drink it and said nothing else. There was nothing else to say. The work was done. Celine walked out into the pre-dawn streets of the lower city and went back to the palace. She packed one bag. She had already packed one bag, but she went through it again and took out 2 things she did not need and added 2 things she did. She checked on her mother, who was sleeping deeply and whose fever had broken slightly in the night. A good sign, not a guarantee, but a good sign. She pressed her lips to her mother's forehead and breathed in the familiar smell of her and did not let herself stand there too long. She left a letter on the bedside table. It said that she was leaving, and that she was safe, and that she loved her more than any letter could hold, which was true. She left a second letter for the palace physician, requesting, formally and in the clear handwriting her mother had taught her, that he continue her mother's treatment in her absence. She left the physician's name on the envelope in case the wrong person found it first. Then Celine walked through the servants' corridor, through the lower courtyard, and out of the palace gate in the gray pre-dawn light, with one bag on her shoulder, no scent trailing behind her, and the sound of her wolf behind a closed door inside her chest. Very quiet, but still there. She did not look back at the towers, or the windows, or the great carved doors. In the room above, at the hour the sun came over the eastern ridge, Cale Ravencrest woke from a shallow and unsatisfying sleep, with a hollow in his chest that had not been there before. He pressed one hand flat against his sternum and stared at the carved ceiling, and told himself it was the wine from the banquet. He told himself it was the weight of the night's business. He told himself many reasonable things, and none of them helped, because the hollow was not in his body, but in some layer below his body, that his wolf kept pawing at like a locked room. His servants came at the usual hour. He dressed. He went to morning court. Lady Scarlet stood at the edge of the room and smiled at him, with the particular smile she had used since the night before. Warm and victorious and subtly possessive, in a way he noticed but did not examine. His trackers were sent that afternoon. He told himself it was protocol. A rejected mate who had walked out of the palace on Blood Moon night was technically a court matter, a loose thread that needed to be accounted for. He told himself this was administrative. The trackers came back in 3 days with nothing. She had been in the lower city. They found a trail that far, to the door of a bread shop, and then the trail ended completely, as though she had stepped off the edge of the world. He sent them again. They came back with nothing. He sent a third group, nothing. The hollow in his chest did not fill. He stopped sending trackers. He had Scarlet beside him, and a kingdom to run, and a decision that had been publicly made, and could not be publicly unmade. He had responsibilities. He had chosen correctly, he told himself, and the discomfort was simply the adjustment of a bond that had formed briefly and been cleanly severed. It would pass. He told himself this for 5 years. It did not pass. Celine nearly died on the 4th day past the border. She had known in theory that the borderlands were rough country. She had read about them in the palace library. The geography, the climate, the particular hazards of the region that sat between the organized pack territories and the genuinely wild lands beyond. She had understood these things as facts. She had not understood them yet as experiences, and there is an enormous difference between knowing what cold water feels like and standing in a river at dusk, in early spring, with the current higher than expected, and your footing gone. On the 4th day, she ran out of food because she had underestimated how much ground she would cover. On the 5th day, she misjudged the ford of a wide, quick river and went in past her waist in water cold enough to make her muscles cramp, and she clawed her way to the far bank and lay there gasping on the stones until she had enough of herself back to move. On the 6th day, she climbed a hillside at dusk with a fever she had not noticed building and collapsed in the scrub grass at the top, with the sky spinning above her and her thoughts scattering like startled birds. She was found by a woman named Clara. Clara was broad-shouldered and dark-haired, and moved through the borderland scrub with the quiet certainty of someone for whom this landscape was simply home. She was perhaps 30, with strong hands and steady eyes, and the particular efficiency of movement that belongs to people who have never had the luxury of wasted motion. She had 3 others with her, a young man called Owen who had lost the use of his left eye, in circumstances he mentioned only once, and then never again, who had a dry humor that emerged at unexpected moments, a quiet older man named Fletcher, who said very little, but always seemed to occupy exactly the right position when someone needed steadying, and a girl of about 15 named Pip, who had been cast from her pack at 12 and had spent 3 years growing from scared into fierce. They were not a pack in the formal sense. They had no alpha, no hierarchical structure, no territory claim filed with the council. They were a collection of the unwanted, wolves who had been cast out for reasons ranging from injury to inconvenience, or who had run from situations that would have broken them, or who had simply found that the world inside established pack borders had no room for the specific shape of person they were. They called the place they lived the Hollow, which Celine learned was both a name and an accurate description, a deep, natural depression in the hillside, sheltered by old-growth trees on 3 sides and a stone face on the 4th, with a spring that ran clean and cold through summer and winter both, and a south-facing aspect that caught what warmth the sun offered. Clara carried Celine the last mile to the Hollow on her back. She did not make a point of this afterward. She set Celine down inside the warmth of the main shelter, covered her with 2 blankets, and started water heating. "You have no scent," Clara said, not as an accusation, when Celine was warm and conscious, and capable of sitting upright with a cup of broth in both hands. "I almost walked past you entirely. Pip heard your breathing and pulled me back." "I know," Celine said. "It was intentional." Clara studied her with those steady eyes. Then she nodded. The way people nod when they understand that a thing has a history they are not being told and have decided not to require the telling. "You can stay," she said. "We do not ask what people are running from. We ask what people can do." "I am a healer," Celine said. What followed was a month of work so thorough that it reorganized Celine's understanding of what her hands were capable of. The Hollow had been getting by on Fletcher's rough field knowledge and Pip's natural instinct for plants, both of which were real and not nothing, but which were also not trained. Owen had an old infection behind his damaged eye that had been present so long he had stopped noticing the constant dull ache of it. Celine cleared it in 2 weeks of careful daily treatment. Fletcher had carried a damaged shoulder for so long that he held his whole right side differently, favoring it unconsciously in every movement. She rebuilt his range of motion over a month with a regime of exercises and heat applications and a compound of her own making that worked on deep tissue better than anything in the standard formulas. Pip had a back molar that had been causing silent pain for over a year. Celine pulled it on a calm afternoon with a steady hand, and Pip did not make a sound. Afterward, touching her jaw with an expression of mild, wondering relief. Word traveled the way word travels among people who exist at the margins, quietly, sideways, through chance encounters and careful recommendations. She did not advertise. She did not need to. In the first month, 3 more wolves came to the Hollow, asking if the healer was real. In the second month, 7. By the end of the third month, there were 26 people in the Hollow, and Celine had moved from a borrowed blanket to a proper room with a proper cot and a shelf along one wall, where she lined up her medicines in order of how often she reached for them. She did not think about Cale Ravencrest. She was methodical about this. When his face appeared in her mind, and it did, she was honest with herself about this. It came sometimes in the flat and vulnerable moment between waking and sleeping. She replaced it with something immediate and concrete. The next medicine to prepare. The next patient. The next thing her hands needed to do. Her hands were very good at this, at pulling her mind to what was present and necessary, and she was grateful for them. What she could not be methodical about was what she discovered in the 6th week. She sat with the fact for 3 full days before she told anyone. She sat with it the way she sat with hard diagnoses, letting herself understand it fully before she decided what to do about it. On the 4th day, she told Clara, in the kitchen, while they sorted dried herbs together, because Clara's hands were always busy when she listened, and that made the listening easier to receive. Clara did not say anything for a long moment. She continued sorting with her strong, careful hands. Then she said, "What do you need? Not who, not how, not what on earth are you going to do. Just what do you need?" It was the question of someone who had decided that the relevant information was what came next, not what had already happened. Celine had not cried since the night of the blood moon ceremony. She cried now, quietly, without making it a large thing, and Clara focused intently on the herbs until it was finished. "I need to stay," Celine said. "I need this to be a safe place." "It is safe," Clara said. "And you will stay." She stayed. The months moved through their seasons. The child grew inside her, and she worked steadily through the pregnancy, in the way her mother had always worked through difficulty, not ignoring it, not making it the center of everything, but incorporating it into the daily practice of being alive and useful. The Hollow grew around her. 40 wolves, then 60. People built more permanent structures with the knowledge the community was accumulating. They dug a better root cellar. They organized a formal watch rotation with clear shifts. Celine expanded her healing room to 2 beds and a proper dispensary shelf, and trained Pip as a full assistant. And Pip turned out to be genuinely gifted. Steady hands, calm manner, excellent memory for compound names and preparation steps, and a completely unshakable constitution in the face of unpleasant medical realities. Something changed in Celine's healing gift as the child grew. It had always been reliable, steady and skilled, grounded in genuine training. But a new quality entered it that she had no category for. A soft silver light that gathered sometimes in her palms when she was working on a serious wound, barely visible in good daylight but unmistakable at dusk or in the dim interior of the healing room. Where the light touched, things healed faster than they should have. She said nothing about it to anyone. She let it do its work quietly and filed the knowledge of it away to examine later, when she had time for such things. Her son was born in autumn, when the leaves on the trees above the Hollow turned red and gold, and the air had that particular cleanness that comes before the first frost. The birth was attended by Clara and Pip and Fletcher, who waited outside the door, and whose boots she could hear pacing a careful, worried rhythm on the wooden boards throughout. When it was done and the child lay against her chest, making the small, fierce sounds of someone recently arrived and deeply opinionated about the experience, Clara looked at his face, and then looked at Celine with an expression that asked the question without asking it. His name is Caden, Celine said. Clara looked at the silver eyes, those specific, unmistakable eyes, and then back at Celine. She nodded once and went to tell Fletcher he could stop pacing. Caden grew up knowing the Hollow as the whole world, which was exactly as it should be at the age of 1 and 2 and 3. He learned the names of plants from his mother and the names of birds from Owen, who knew more about birds than any wolf had a right to, and considered this a perfectly reasonable area of expertise. He learned not to touch certain things on the healing room shelf from Pip, who had a direct and effective method of communicating the point. He learned from Clara that work was not a punishment, but simply what you did, and from Fletcher that silent company was a valid form of affection. He was 4 years old, with dark hair and silver eyes, and a laugh that erupted unexpectedly in the way the sun comes out during rain, suddenly and completely, and making everything briefly brighter. He did not know what he was yet. He was a small person in a world of people who loved him, and the Hollow was sufficient. Meanwhile, in the kingdom behind its distant borders, things were moving. She knew this only through the travelers who passed through the Hollow sometimes, carrying news the way boots carry mud, without particular intention. She heard fragments. The king had formally chosen Lady Scarlet Duskbane as his Luna. The ceremony had been well attended. The court had celebrated. Life had continued in the way that life continues when powerful people make decisions that affect mostly other people. Then the news changed. A sickness, travelers said, moving through the Western Pack territories first, then spreading slowly east. Not a standard illness, not the wolf fever that came through every decade or so, not any of the recognized seasonal complaints. Something different. Wolves who had broken bonds, who had rejected mates, or who had been cast from their packs by force, were falling into a deep and wasting lethargy. The shamans were studying it. The kingdom's physicians were puzzled. The common name that emerged among the packs was bond rot, which was not a medical term, but was accurate in the way that naming things from the inside of their experience often is. Celine listened to these reports with a healer's careful attention and a private, complicated stillness that she kept entirely inside herself. She did not say aloud what she was thinking. She focused on the Hollow. She focused on Caden, who was currently very interested in whether a particular type of stone could be used to make things, and on the 17 new wolves who had arrived in the past 2 months, and on the fact that the roof of the East Shelter needed attention before winter. She had built something here. She intended to keep building it. She was simply not naive enough to think it would stay untouched forever, and she had been a healer long enough to know that whatever you prepare for is never quite what arrives. On the morning that changed everything, Celine was in the healing room carefully removing a deep thorn cluster from Owen's good right hand. The thorns were from a plant that grew near the spring, one that the community had learned to avoid, but that Owen had apparently forgotten to avoid in the specific excitement of finding a new bird. When Pip appeared in the doorway, with wide eyes and a voice she was working very hard to keep level. "There are people at the outer edge of the Hollow," Pip said. 6 of them, on the main approach trail. They are carrying the king's mark on their travel bags. The room went quiet. Owen did not move. Celine set her instruments down with hands that were steady by long practice and looked at Pip. "How far? Half a mile? Maybe a little more?" Fletcher saw them from the upper ridge. "He says they are walking in plain sight and not trying to move quietly." "That is deliberate," Celine said. "They want us to know they are coming." She thought through the geometry of the situation quickly and completely, the way she thought through medical emergencies. Fast, orderly, no wasted motion. Bring in everyone from the outer paths and the garden. Tell Clara to meet me at the main gate. Caden stays in the back orchard with Fletcher and 2 of the watch. Not inside, 2 enclosed if we need to move, but away from the front of the Hollow. Pip, you finish the thorn removal when I am gone. The wound is clean, and the rest is straightforward. Pip nodded and moved to the instrument table. Owen extended his hand patiently. Celine washed her own hands, dried them on the clean cloth beside the basin, straightened her healer's apron, tucked a loose strand of hair back, and walked to the gate. She had built a reputation in the borderland territories that had nothing to do with who she had once been or where she had come from. Among the packless wolves and the wanderers and the communities that existed in the spaces between formal territories, she was known simply as the Hollow's Luna, a title the community had given her collectively and without asking her permission, which was exactly how genuine titles worked as opposed to official ones. No one in the borderlands knew her birth name. No one could track her by scent. She was the healer who did not turn people away, and the Luna, who kept the hollow standing, and she intended to meet these visitors as exactly that person. The king's party came through the trees in single file. 6 guards in dark blue travel clothes, rode dusty and watchful. And then, behind the guards, walking as though the path had been waiting specifically for his feet, Cale Ravencrest. He was not in ceremonial dress. He wore dark travel clothing, plain and well-made, and his silver-gray eyes moved over the hollow's outer wall and the people gathering behind it with the organized attentiveness of someone who reads a situation before they enter it. His face was 5 years older than the face she had made herself stop seeing in the space between sleeping and waking. The lines of it were sharper. He moved with the same weight he had always carried, that particular density of presence that came from years of being the person in the room who everyone else arranged themselves around. His gaze reached the figure standing at the gate. He stopped. She watched him process what he was seeing. A woman in a healer's apron, dark hair drawn back simply, hands at her sides. A gaze that met his without flinching, and without recognition, in the way he would have been expecting recognition. No startle, no fear, no anything that said she knew who he was beyond what her eyes could see. And this was the thing she had built her approach around, the foundation of everything. No scent. Not a trace of her. To his wolf senses, she was a blank, a walking absence, a person-shaped silence in the scent landscape. He did not know her. She had known he would not, and she had known it the way she knew certain medicines would work. Not as hope, but as understood fact. "You have come a long way," she said. Her voice was level and carried clearly, and held exactly the professional warmth she used when receiving injured strangers. The Hollow receives those who need healing. Tell me your need. One of his advisors, a stiff-backed man she would later learn was called Colton, stepped forward. His Majesty King Cale Ravencrest requests an audience with the healer known as the Scentless Luna. The matter is the bond rot sickness spreading through the Western and Central Pack territories. The kingdom's shamans have identified the Hollow's healer as the only practitioner in the known territories with documented success treating advanced cases of this condition. That assessment is accurate, Celine said. You may come in. Weapons remain at the gate. The silence that followed was the particular silence that happens when a powerful man is told something he is unaccustomed to being told. She waited it out without adjusting her expression. Cale unclasped his own blade and handed it to Colton. His guards followed. They came through the gate. She led them through the Hollow, at the measured pace she used for every tour. Not so slow it suggested she had something to hide by taking time. Not so fast they could not observe what they were seeing. She showed them the healing room and its records, the communal spaces that functioned smoothly, the medicine garden laid out in the precise and useful order she had developed over years. She spoke about the bond rot cases she had treated, the progression of symptoms, the point at which intervention was most effective, the compound preparations she had developed through trial and systematic observation that interrupted the fever cycle and gave the wolf spirit something to anchor to, while the deeper wound of a broken bond was addressed through other means. She spoke as a healer giving a professional account. Every word of it was true. They were gathered in the Hollow's large meeting room, Celine presenting case documentation she had retrieved from the healing room's orderly files, when it happened. The door at the far end of the room opened the way doors open when operated by small people who have not yet been persuaded that doors need to be treated gently. Caden came through at a run, the way he always moved when something interesting was happening somewhere else, and he intended to investigate it. He had a wooden carving of a bird in one hand that Owen had made him, and orchard dirt across his forehead from whatever he had been doing before Fletcher had presumably failed to keep him in the back orchard, and he was mid-sentence about a feather Owen had promised to attach when the room full of strangers stopped him in his tracks. He looked at them with the calm assessment of a child who has grown up around many different kinds of people, arriving at the Hollow in many different states, and who has therefore developed a generally curious, rather than fearful response to strangers. He was 5 years old and unhurried and very interested in people. His silver eyes moved from face to face. They settled, with the simple instinct of children and animals, on the most significant presence in the room. He looked at Cale Ravencrest. Cale looked back at him. Celine had 3 heartbeats of seeing it happen, watching the king's eyes take in the dark hair, the jaw, the specific and utterly distinctive color and shape of the eyes looking back at him, before she moved. She crossed to Caden, crouched to his level, and said quietly, "Go find Fletcher, love. Tell him that I said the three of you can have supper early tonight in the orchard." Caden examined this proposal with the gravity of someone weighing an important decision. Then he nodded, turned, and ran back out the door with the wooden bird under his arm. The room was very quiet. Celine stood. She turned to face the king. He was looking at her, and the expression on his face was no longer the controlled, diplomatic expression of a king managing a sensitive foreign visit. It was the face of a man who has just understood that the ground he is standing on is different from what he thought it was, and has not yet determined what that means for the next step. She held his eyes and said nothing. She let him be in the moment with what he knew, which was incomplete, and what he felt, which was not. Colton cleared his throat. "Perhaps we might return to the treatment protocols." "Leave us," Cale said. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. The room cleared with notable efficiency. When the last footstep had faded, Celine remained standing in the center of the space with her hands at her sides and watched Cale Ravencrest search for words adequate to the size of the question he needed to ask. "That child," he said. "Is mine," she said. He took one step toward her. "His eyes are his own," she said. "He is 5 years old. His name is Caden. He has never been inside your borders, and he has never required anything from your kingdom." She kept her voice exactly level, her hands exactly still. "You came here about the bond rot. That is the conversation I am prepared to have." He looked at her, really looked, in the way he had looked at her across the altar table 5 years ago, with that quality of attention that did not look away. And she thought, watching him work through what he was seeing, what he was understanding, what he was not yet willing to say, that 5 years had changed him in ways she had not anticipated, and should not have been surprised by, because 5 years changes everyone, herself very much included. "I know you," he said, quietly and with complete certainty. She met his eyes steadily. "You knew someone, once," she said. "She is gone. I am the person she became after you let her go." She picked up the case files from the table and opened the first one and began, in her clear and methodical professional voice, to explain what bond rot was, where it originated, what drove its progression, and what she had found to interrupt it. After a long moment, he sat down across the table from her, and he listened. He was a good listener. She had not known this about him. She filed it away without comment and kept speaking. He stayed. She had not told him he could stay. She had not told him he could not. She had provided the initial briefing on the treatment protocols and told him that the full documentation would take several days to compile and review, which was true. Whether he chose to remain in the Hollow's vicinity during that time was his own decision. She did not make it for him and did not offer an opinion on it. On the second day, he sent his guards back to the nearest town to wait. She received this information from Colton without visible reaction. On the third day, Cale asked if there was work he could do while the documentation was being compiled, work that was useful to the community. She regarded him for a moment and then gave him a task that required no special knowledge and a great deal of patience: the boiling and folding of cloth for wound dressings, which needed to be done with consistency and attention and no shortcuts. He did it correctly. He asked 2 questions about why each step mattered and then did not ask more questions, which suggested he had understood that the why informed the how and that further questions would be answered by the practice itself. On the 4th day, she put him in the healing room as Pip's assistant. Pip, who at this point knew only that he was a man from the kingdom with some kind of official purpose, gave him clear and direct instruction in the same tone she used with every new helper, which was matter-of-fact and completely unimpressed by anything other than whether the task was done right. He followed her direction with focused attention and did not perform either humility or competence, which suggested he was simply trying to actually learn, and that this was unusual enough in his daily life that it had a particular quality of concentration to it. Caden made his own assessment. He watched the new man from a careful distance for 2 full days, which was his standard practice with arrivals he was uncertain about. He came to his conclusions in the way he came to all conclusions, by observation, without being pushed. On the 5th morning, he appeared at the edge of the spring, where Cale was sharpening a tool, borrowed from Fletcher, and sat nearby, and watched the process with the focused attention he gave to anything mechanical. "You are holding it wrong," he said. Cale looked down at the tool, then at the boy, "Show me," he said. Caden showed him. He explained, with the authority of someone trained by a man who felt very strongly about correct tool maintenance, the proper angle, and the correct pressure, and the way to know when the edge was right, without cutting yourself to check. Cale followed the correction without any of the condescension or impatient humor that adults sometimes use to manage the instructions of small people who are technically right. He simply adjusted his grip and tried again. Caden watched critically. Then he nodded. "Better," he said, and went back to his other business. Celine watched this from across the spring, her own hands occupied, her face doing nothing in particular. She looked back down at her work before he could catch her watching, and she told herself that the thing moving in her chest was simply the natural response of a mother watching her child interact with an unknown variable and finding the variable less dangerous than anticipated. She told herself this very firmly. She was a practical woman. She kept her hands busy and her assessments clear. On the 8th day, she told him about Scarlett. Not because she had planned to, and not as an act of strategy. It came up sideways, the way things that have been held tightly eventually surface, during a conversation about something adjacent, while they were walking the hollow's outer perimeter at dusk, because she did the perimeter walk every evening, and he had fallen into the habit of accompanying her, which she had neither invited nor prohibited, because the perimeter walk was functionally a supervision of the hollow's safety, and another pair of observant eyes was a practical asset regardless of who they belonged to. She had mentioned the timing of the Bond rot spread. He had said the shamans traced it to the period 3 years after Scarlett had taken the Luna position. She had said, carefully, that the shamans were accurate about the timing, but had perhaps identified the effect, while missing the deeper cause. He had turned to look at her. She told him what she had assembled from years of fragments. The wolfsbane, low dose and steady, in the wine meant for the king, designed to dull the bond sense and make the instincts that might have pushed toward the mate bond easier to override. The council work, begun months before the blood moon ceremony, persuading the right people that any lowborn mate claim would be a liability the kingdom could not afford. The specific, deliberate orchestration by Scarlett of a situation in which the rejection was not just likely, but essentially scripted. Cale was quiet for a long time after she finished speaking. They continued the perimeter walk. The trees were quiet around them. "That does not absolve me," he said. "No," she said. "It does not. The words were yours. The choice was yours. You were positioned to make that specific choice by someone working carefully to make sure you would, but you are still the person who made it." She kept walking. "I am not telling you this so you can feel better. I am telling you because you need to know it when you go back, and because what you do with that information when you get there will matter to a great many people." He stopped walking. "When I go back," he said. "Not if." She stopped and turned to face him. The sun had nearly gone, and the hollow's lights were coming on behind them through the trees, warm and scattered. She could hear Caden somewhere in there, his voice carrying the particular rising cadence of a vigorous argument about something important. "You have a kingdom," she said. "You have people who depend on the decisions made inside your borders. The bond rot will keep spreading as long as the conditions that cause it remain unchanged. The broken bonds, the cast-out wolves, the choices like the one that was made 5 years ago. The healing has to happen there, not here. I cannot do it from the borderlands." She met his eyes. "And I am not asking to. I built something here. I am not leaving it. And Caden," he said. "Caden is safe and loved and happy," she said. "What happens with Caden over time is not something I am deciding tonight. It is something that will be decided by how things actually unfold, and it will be decided on his terms more than anyone else's." She held his gaze. "What I know is that a man who appears in a child's life and then disappears because the political situation changed is worse for that child than no father at all. I will not permit the first option unless the second option is genuinely off the table." He looked at her for a long moment. "I am not going anywhere yet," he said. They finished the perimeter in silence. But the silence had changed from what it had been on the first day. It had become the silence of two people in the same space rather than on opposite sides of something, which was a smaller thing than it sounded, but also, she thought, a more important one. The rider came that same night. He arrived at the outer edge 2 hours after dark, one of the palace's fast riders who had followed the king's route from transit point to transit point until he found the hollow. He did not come through the gate. He handed a sealed letter to one of the watch. Who brought it to Colton? Who brought it to Cale? Cale read it by the fire in the main meeting room. Celine sat across the room and watched his face. He looked up. His expression was controlled and very still. Scarlet has sent word to a warlord who operates in the eastern wild territories, he said. A man who has been looking for a pretext to move against a settled borderland community for the past 2 years. She has given him the Hollow's location and told him that the king's extended absence from the palace is consent for any action he wishes to take in the border territories. He set the letter down. If I do not return to the palace within 3 days, he will interpret that as an open invitation. The fire crackled. Outside, the hollow was quiet and dark. Celine was silent for a moment. Then she said, "How many people does he have?" Cale looked at her with an expression that was partly surprise and partly, she thought, something more than that. He had expected her to tell him to go. More than the hollow can hold off with what it currently has. How many do your guards have in the town? 19. Bring them here tonight, she said. She stood and was already running the logistics before she had finished speaking. Clara takes the north approach. Owen and his watch take the west. Your guards cover the south road and the east line where it's most exposed. Fletcher knows the terrain between here and the ridge better than anyone. He goes with whoever takes the perimeter positions. She looked at him. You sent your guards away to show me you were not here as a king. That was worth doing, and I am not dismissing it. But right now, I need you to be a king with 19 trained guards, and I need them here before dawn. He was already moving. What arrived at first light was 43 of the warlord's people coming through the eastern tree line. What met them was an organized defense with Cale's guards anchoring the south and east, the Hollow's own fighters, Clara, who moved through the dark with lethal efficiency, Owen, with his one eye, and his startling instinct for where a threat was before it arrived, Fletcher, whose rebuilt shoulder worked now as it had not in years, holding the north and west, and Celine at the main gate, directing the overall shape of it, with the calm of someone who had been responsible for other people's survival for 5 years, and had no intention of changing that record now. The warlord had expected vulnerable healers. He had not done his research carefully enough. The fight was not long. The warlord's people retreated with significant discouragement and no victory. In the final disorganized minutes of the exchange, a blade came from an angle no one had fully covered, thrown rather than swung, aimed at Caden, who had of course not stayed in the back orchard, because something loud was happening, and he was 5 years old, and this was his home being defended, and he understood this, with perfect child's logic, as a reason to be present rather than a reason to be away. The blade was in the air for less than a second before Cale crossed 12 feet of ground and put himself in its path. He went down hard on his side in the churned earth. Celine reached him in the same breath. Her hands came down on the wound and the silver light came with them, brighter here in the dark and urgency than she had ever seen it, and she pressed her palms flat and worked. Behind her she was dimly aware of Caden's voice, higher and more frightened than she had ever heard it, calling for her, with the specific panic of a child who has seen something they did not know the world contained. Owen had him. She could hear Owen's steady voice explaining that Celine working was the opposite of helpless, that this was what it looked like when help was happening. Cale kept his eyes open. He looked at her hands and the light with the expression of a man processing something that fell outside his existing categories. I did not know you could do that, he said. His voice was holding together through effort. I have been learning for 5 years, she said, and did not look up from the work. He almost smiled. She did not look at that either. She focused on the wound, on the silver light, on the work, and let everything else be where it was. He recovered. On the day Colton began quietly packing the remaining records and travel equipment, Celine sat with Caden at the edge of the spring in the late morning light and told him, in the direct and complete way she told him everything, that the man who had come to the Hollow was his father, that his father was a king, and that kings had responsibilities that called them back to their kingdoms. Caden thought about this with his chin propped on his knees. He was quiet for a while, which was not his natural state, but which he was capable of when something required it. Does he know how to do the sharpening right now? Caden asked. He does, Celine said. Caden nodded, apparently satisfied that the important question had been resolved. Then he got up and went to find the wooden bird and the feather Owen had finally attached to it that morning. Celine remained at the spring. The water moved in its steady way, unhurried, following the shape of the ground. She listened to it, and let herself sit with what was true, and what was uncertain, and what was becoming. Cale found her there. He sat down beside her without asking, which he had stopped asking about days ago, and they were quiet together in the way they had learned to be, two people in the same place rather than on opposite sides of something. "I owe you more than anything I know how to say," he said at last. "You owe me nothing," she said. "What happened between us and the choices I made because of it, those were my own. I do not carry them as a debt you have to repay. I carry them as what made me who I am." She looked at the water. What these 9 days were, that was not payment for what was owed. That was something beginning to be different. "What do I need to do when I go back?" he said. She looked at him then, fully, the way she had avoided looking at him in the early days, because she had not trusted herself to look and stay practical. She looked at him and said what she had been thinking for the past 2 days, clearly, and without softening it into something easier to receive. Change the conditions that created the bond rot. End the public rejection practice. Create real recourse for wolves who have been cast out without cause. Send resources to borderland communities that are doing the work your kingdom should be doing, inside its own borders. Expose what Scarlet did, not as personal revenge, but because the court needs to understand how decisions were being manipulated, and because wolves who were hurt by those decisions deserve the truth. She paused. "And do it because it is right, and because it needs doing, not because you think it will bring me back. I will know the difference." He listened to all of it. He did not argue with any of it. "I will do it," he said. She believed him. Not with the simple faith of someone who has not yet been disappointed, but with the more durable belief of someone who has watched a person carry water and follow instruction and step in front of a thrown blade, which tells you more about what someone is made of than 100 formal promises. She stood, and he stood beside her, and they walked back through the hollow to where Caden was showing his father, with patient authority, a final review of the tool-sharpening technique before his departure. Cale paid attention with complete seriousness and asked one clarifying question, and Caden answered it, and then declared the lesson finished and ran off with the wooden bird and its new feather. The guards were ready. Colton had the records organized. The horses were brought from the town by midday. Cale stood at the gate of the hollow with his travel things and looked at Celine. "I will write when I have done what you asked," he said. "I know," she said. "I will write anyway," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I know that too," she said. He rode south. She watched the party until the trees took them, and then she turned back to the hollow and the day's work, which was waiting in its patient way, and she went to do it. Colton's documentation was thorough. It had been prepared methodically, over the days in the hollow, with the quiet competence of a man who understood that the most important preparation was the one that happened before it was needed. The records of Scarlet's wolfsbane purchases were sourced from 3 separate supply accounts, cross-referenced with dates that mapped precisely onto the king's reduced bond sensitivity in the months before the Blood Moon ceremony. The correspondence with the Eastern Warlord was documented through the Message Rider network, with specific dates and courier identifications. The list of council members who had received private approaches from Scarlet in the 2 months before the ceremony was verified against appointment records that Colton had obtained from the palace secretary's office before the journey began, which meant he had suspected the shape of this situation even before the hollow confirmed it. Cale returned to the palace in travel clothes and road dust, and went directly to the Great Hall without stopping at his chambers. He called the full council, summoned the senior shamans, and had the court assembled within the hour. He stood before them without ascending to the throne, and spoke from the floor, which was not customary, and which therefore had the quality of something real, rather than something ceremonial. He told them what he had learned at the hollow. He told them what bond rot was, and what caused it, and what could interrupt it, and he told them how a community of rejected wolves in the borderlands had developed more effective treatments than his own kingdom's resources had produced, because the people in that community were living with the problem every day rather than studying it from a distance. He told them what needed to change and why, and what it was going to cost in the short term, and what it would cost everyone more if it did not happen. Then he told them about Scarlet. He did not perform this. He did not build to it or frame it dramatically, or use it as a way of managing anyone's reaction. He simply stated what the documentation showed, and Colton set the documentation on the council table in orderly stacks for anyone who wished to verify any of it. Scarlet faced the assembled court with composure. She had been composing herself for this possibility for years, which was visible in how she received it. Not with the expression of someone surprised, but with the expression of someone who has been holding a last card and is now deciding how to play it. She admitted the wolfsbane. She admitted the council persuasion. She contested the warlord correspondence in terms that were precise and careful and did not survive contact with Colton's documentation. She was removed from the Luna position by formal council vote and given 3 days to leave the capital. Kale did not watch her departure. He was in a 3-hour meeting with the head shamans about a phased implementation of the bond-rot protocols, which was where his attention belonged. He worked, not the performance of work, the actual sustained daily labor of changing systems, which is unglamorous and resistant, and requires the same persistent patience as the sharpening of a tool, the same attention to whether you are holding the angle correctly, the same willingness to adjust and try again when it is not working yet. He ended the formalized practice of public bond rejections. He created a resettlement provision with genuine resources behind it for wolves removed from packs without cause, working with his council to identify 3 communities that would serve as receiving settlements rather than simply abandoning people at the border. He sent material support to 6 borderland communities, doing stabilization work that the kingdom had previously benefited from without acknowledging. He wrote to Celine. His letters were what hers were in response: detailed, practical, professional in their structure. He described what he was doing and what the results were, and what the resistance looked like and what was working. She wrote back with equal precision, and occasionally with a dry observation about the resistance that made him read the sentence twice. He found himself looking forward to her letters with a consistency and specificity that was informative about what he felt, and he did not pretend otherwise to himself, which he considered the least he owed himself after 5 years of pretending about the hollow in his chest. This continued for 8 months. In the 9th month, she came. She arrived on a plain cart with Clara, Caden, and Owen, without announcement or ceremony, or any of the apparatus that arrivals at the palace usually involved. The gate guard sent word up with an expression of slight bafflement, and Kale was in the middle of a budget review with 2 senior advisors when the word reached him. He ended the session without finishing the sentence he was in the middle of, and went down himself. They were in the lower courtyard. Caden was already in conversation with a palace stable worker about the horses, the specific and technical conversation of a child who has questions and expects them answered. Owen had located a cat somewhere in the courtyard structure and was sitting against the wall in a patch of sunlight, making its acquaintance. Clara was standing in the center of the courtyard, looking up at the palace walls with the frank assessing gaze of someone cataloging structural details. Celine was standing slightly apart from all of them, in her plain traveling clothes, with her healer's bag at her feet, and a calm about her that was not performing calmness, but simply being it, the way someone is calm when they have decided what they are doing, and know why. Kale walked across the courtyard. He stopped in front of her. They looked at each other. "You came," he said. "I wanted to see what the work looked like from the inside," she said. "The letters describe it, but letters are a particular kind of seeing." This was true, and also, they both understood, not entirely the reason. They did not go to the Great Hall. They went to the kitchen garden at the back of the palace, which he had not been in since childhood, and which had continued growing in his absence without requiring his attention, the way good things that are well established do. It was a good place to talk. There was something about being among growing things that made honesty easier, or perhaps it was simply that no one held formal court in a kitchen garden, and so the room did not have ceremony attached to it. They talked for a very long time, about the Hollow and the Kingdom, and the work being done in both, and about Caden, and about the months of letters, and about smaller things. The bird that Caden had decided was his particular bird, and reported on regularly, the specific way Owen had become the definitive authority on every cat in the borderland territory, the ongoing debate in the Hollow about whether the East Shelter needed a second room or a whole new building. They talked about things that had happened 5 years ago, not to revisit them, but because they were part of the ground the present was standing on, and pretending otherwise would be like building on earth that had not been tested. The sun moved across the sky. Caden came to report twice on findings from the garden that required adult attention. Owen had moved from the stable cat to a completely different cat of palace origin and seemed deeply satisfied with his afternoon. Clara had apparently introduced herself to the head cook on the basis of mutual interest in resource organization and was now in a detailed discussion about the palace's herb sourcing. At some point in the late afternoon, Cale said, "I want to tell you something I have understood in the past 8 months." She looked at him. She waited. "The hollow in my chest," he said. "The one that was there when I woke up the morning after the ceremony. I told myself for 5 years it was something else. I told myself it would fill on its own." He met her eyes. "It did not fill because it was the shape of something specific. It was the shape of a wrong that I had committed and not faced, and the shape of a person I had dismissed and not seen." He paused. "I am not telling you this as a way of asking for something. I am telling you because you deserve to know that I know what I did, and that I have been awake about it for a long time, and that I intend to spend a long time being awake about it." She was quiet for a moment. She thought of the silver pendant and the cold stone floor, and the long walk into the borderlands. She thought of Clara's voice saying, "What do you need?" and Pip's steady hands, and Fletcher's careful shoulder, and Caden's laugh like sudden sunlight. She thought of 5 years of building something real out of what had been refused and discarded and left behind, and of who she was now because of that building. "I know you know," she said. "I have known for weeks, maybe longer." She looked at the garden. The light was getting long and warm. "What I am still deciding is not whether to believe you. I believe you. What I am deciding is what I want the shape of the next thing to be, not what the bond wants. Not what the situation calls for, what I want." "What do you want?" he said. The garden was quiet around them. Somewhere in it, a small determined voice was explaining something important to one of the gardeners, who was listening with admirable patience. Celine was quiet for a moment. She thought about the question the way she thought about hard ones, fully, without rushing to an answer that would fit neatly. "I want to be here as who I am," she said. "Not as a mate recovered, or a problem resolved, or a wrong made right. I want to be here as the person I became, with the work I have built and the community I am responsible to, and the son I am raising. I want those things to have space inside whatever this is, not to be set aside because this is supposed to be a different kind of story." She looked at him. "And I want to move at the pace of something real, not the pace of a ceremony, not the pace of what looks right from the outside." "Yes," he said. "That is not a simple answer," she said. "I know," he said. "I am agreeing anyway." The evening bells began to ring across the city. Caden appeared at the garden entrance with news about a discovery involving a very old stone near the herb beds that he considered historically significant, and insisted on leading both of them to examine it immediately. They went. The stone turned out to be unremarkable by any standard except Caden's, but they looked at it with the seriousness it deserved, which was the seriousness a 5-year-old brings to things, which is genuine and not measured by any external scale. Walking back toward the garden's main path, Caden reached up and took Cale's hand. He did it without any particular announcement, the way children do the things adults make complicated, simply and directly, and as if it were the obvious next step. Cale looked down at the small hand in his. Then he looked up at Celine, and she met his eyes with the look she had been practicing not having for 9 days in the hollow, and had run out of reasons to practice anymore. It was not a promise. It was the kind of thing that becomes one later, slowly, in the daily accumulation of showing up and doing the work and being present in the specific shape of the specific person you actually are. That night, for the first time since the morning after the blood moon ceremony, the hollow in Cale Ravencrest's chest was simply gone. Not filled with something that papered over it. Gone. Because the wrong it had marked was being faced, and the woman it had been shaped around was standing 20 feet away in his kitchen garden arguing gently with his son about what constituted a historically significant stone. And Celine, standing in that garden with the evening air on her face, felt something in her chest open that she had been holding closed for 5 years with both hands. Not the bond. That was something older and quieter, present, since the night of the ceremony, and never fully silenced even by the rite of ash. Something around the bond, something she had built to protect herself from being undone by something she had not chosen, and which she was now, slowly, deliberately, with full knowledge of what she was doing, choosing to let breathe. Her scent returned that night. It came back the way real things return, not all at once, and not with ceremony, but present in the morning, in a way it had not been the night before, the way the season turns while you are sleeping. The wolf behind the closed door in her chest found the door open. Not thrown open, not broken down, simply open, because the person who had been holding it shut had decided to let it rest. By sunrise, the palace was different in the way places become different when the right thing has finally happened in them. The guards at the gate did not know why the air seemed cleaner. The kitchen staff did not know why the morning felt more settled. The cats that Owen had discovered in great number in the palace's various corners moved through the corridors as they always had. But in the kitchen garden, where the spring light was coming in at the angle that made everything look briefly like a painting, Celine Vale stood among the herb beds with her healer's hands and her silver light, and the sound of her wolf clear inside her for the first time in 5 years, and she was exactly who she had made herself into. Not who she had been before the rejection, not who she had been in the moment of the rejection. The person she had become in everything that came after, in the borderlands and the hollow, and the years of building, and the daily work of being responsible for other people's lives, and her son's and her own. She had walked out of this palace once with 1 bag and no scent, and a choice she had made with clear eyes. She walked through it now the same way, with clear eyes, with steady hands, with the knowledge of what she was worth so long established inside her that it needed no voice from outside to confirm it. The hollow would be there when she returned, because she had built it to hold itself. Clara was there, and Fletcher, and Pip with her steady, careful hands, and Owen and his birds and his cats. The work would continue, because real things continue when they are built on real ground. And here, in the palace that had once held her absence like an unanswered question, something new was beginning. Not a return, not a restoration, something with no old name, which meant it was genuinely new, and new things had always been where she did her best work. By sunrise, her scent filled the halls. This time, no one let it fade.